Yes. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another Monday Fix with Us, a 6-year-old platform for critical thinking from Goa. In 2008, the great human rights scholar, Dr. Upendra Bakshi, gave a speech on animal rights in India. He chose to begin his speech with a long caveat. I'm going to read a short extract from that caveat. He says, when some friends heard the title of my talk, they wondered, given my advancing age, was I turning religious and right-wing, as if no interfaith or secular argument may be made for animal rights. From this, I learned how communalized our discourse about animal rights has become, and this ought to remain a matter of serious concern. Some friends have gone so far as to suggest that any pursuit of animal rights remains ethically extravagant in a subcontinent of harrowing political injustices towards the humans. This suggests a species unique understanding of what makes us human and privileges ways of ethical thinking in the service of the distinctively human. Talking about animal rights constitutes a provocation precisely because it requires us to engage in interspecies thinking, concern, and action. The quote ends. Almost 12 years hence, after Dr. Bakshi's speech, we welcome you to a joint session with Animaleft and Thus, titled Solidarity Across Species Boundaries, precisely to normalize and carve a legitimate space for conversations on animal rights in Indian politics. We have a great panel here today. Kavita Krishnan is a women's rights activist and the secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association. Sudhir Krishnaswamy, the Vice Chancellor of the National Law School of India, Bangalore. Varda Mehrotra is the Executive Director of FIAPO, the Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organizations, and CliftonD'Rozario, an advocate and National Secretary of the All India Central Council of Trade Unions. The conversation will be moderated by Rajesh Kasturirangan, a mathematician and cognitive scientist, also a co-founder of Animaleft, and I yield the floor to him. Rajesh.
Thank you, Alok. I will wear my Animaleft founder hat for the next hour or so. And I want to first of all welcome all my co-panelists. Thank you so much for making this time. I know everybody here is busy. A brief introduction to Animaleft. The founding principle of Animaleft is that both the animal rights discourse and the communities around animal rights and both the traditional and the modern left can benefit enormously from engaging with each other and expanding their communities. So this builds upon a huge movement in the last decade or so, where, for example, what climate change has gone from peripheral to left-wing discourse to at the center, right? And to the deep understanding that the capitalist system, for example, implicates climate change and traditional forms of labor exploitation. So what we would like to see in Animaleft is an expansion of that to include non-human animals as sort of central players in the kind of systems of oppression and exploitation that we see these days. So Animaleft is by nature an interdisciplinary and intersectional space, both in the concerns that it raises and the methods that it brings. We want to bring art, science, and activism together in one space. And in fact, with that, I am going to start sharing my screen with a video prepared by Mehrotra, an artist who's also an Animaleft member. So just give me 1 sec while I share my screen. Let's see, there it is. Okay, so this is a video. I hope everybody can listen to it.
A 17-foot dead tiger shark is preserved in a tank of formaldehyde and presented in the white cube of an art gallery. According to the artist, the title was just a statement that he had used to describe the idea of death to himself. Among other things, this sculpture brings up the power of the relationship between the viewer's active mind and the shark's dead mind. In contrast, the French artist Pierre Huy presented at his solo museum show a very alive dog, a functional beehive, and a hermit crab in a water tank. The dog is his Ibizan hound with a fuchsia front leg, ironically named Human. The reclining nude with its head obscured by a swarming beehive uses the strategy of grafting a beehive onto a historically significant motif in art. This strategy is used again with the hermit crab carrying a famous Constantine Brancusi bronze shell on its back. Despite the artistic interventions upon these animals in captivity, they manage their regular animal existence with some exercise of free will. Douglas Gordon continues this train of thought, thinking about control and free will, life and death. He arranged for Minnie, a circus elephant, to be transported to the gallery, where he filmed it obeying a series of commands. For instance, repeatedly lying down and then awkwardly struggling to rise. The work stems from the fact that the artist had never seen an elephant lying down, because as it turns out, they don't like to lie down. The film documents Minnie, as well as the conditions of her captivity, which force her to perform anthropomorphized actions without any reference to elephant behavior in the wild. Running Thunder is a 16mm film with no sound, focusing on a horse lying in a green meadow. A fly is seen circling around the horse. When the fly crawls onto its eyeball and the horse doesn't blink, we realize it is dead. The medium of film is about time and motion and activity, and this literal nature mort, a still and stilled life, reminds us of the horse's power, strength, and speed that no longer animates it. In a similar way, the history of performance art is the history of the presence of the artist's animated body. In Petting Zoo, I wanted to address that art historical given by absurdly performing absence. The inert bodies of me and 4 other animals are present, but our consciousness is absent. The films of the process of R going under general anesthesia and recovering from it were eventually combined into a single-channel video work titled Minds to Lose. The human, the 2 goats, the sheep, and the donkey are all presented as subjects that become objects, and back again, precisely so that their lack of consciousness drives home the point that animals also have minds to lose. The film weighs the categories of human and animal, all of whom enjoy a temporary respite from human interference and cultural constraints. In 2010, the American College Art Association convened a task force to craft guidelines for artists and institutions using animals in art and exhibitions. The very presence of the guidelines acknowledges that animals will be part of artworks. As Stella Boats writes, a complete prohibition on animals in art denies their capacity to engage with the human world on questions of meaning and artistic exploration, as well as denying heritages of artistic collaboration with the natural world, which goes back to prehistory. When we elevate animals to untouchable objects of our moral reverence, we forget their mortality and fallibility and run the risk of forgetting our own frailty too.
Thank you. That was Neha, who's in the room. Thank you, Neha, for sharing this wonderful video. Now we're going to move into the panel discussion. So I'm going to open this panel by saying we want to think about possibilities for the future. So we know that animal and meat politics in India is fraught with many, many difficult questions. But I want to start us from a position of hope and the potential for solidarity. So Kavita, I'm going to ask you a question. Putting on, say, a political hat, what do you see the possibilities for a a genuinely liberative politics that includes both humans and animals in India?
Well, this is a bad time to be obviously thinking about this because we are in a situation where the animal or the image of the animal is weaponized. Is weaponized against human beings, especially against the Muslim minorities in India, and of course against Dalits in India. So I think that you have caste and communal politics in power in India today. And I've noticed that a lot of politics in India, around women's rights or around other kinds of rights, we have a lot of lawyers in the room today, and they will recognize this, that there's a tendency to appeal to the state and appeal to lawmaking as an instrument of social change. And I think that that is a dead end as far as this particular subject goes, because I think that not only, of course, right now it is and should be a dead end because of those in power who are actively making laws using the discourse of animal rights, but especially using them as pretext, using these laws as pretexts, more pretexts to arrest and harass and kill Muslims. So I think that that shouldn't be the way to go. The hope that I would hope, the thing that I would hope for, and which doesn't exist right now, is for a honest conversation to happen between various movements where one acknowledges that certain concerns exist, and that certain facts exist, that we need to not blot out certain facts. And so I'll just, when I was preparing for this, this is always a subject which is difficult for me to speak about, very difficult. And so I tried to get around the difficulty by making some notes. So I'll just take a couple of minutes to quickly flag what I did. I made two columns, and I thought that these are two columns which of facts, which are just facts. We just need to acknowledge those. Those are not about opinions. And that is that we have to acknowledge that today animal rights activism as we know it, as in any other sphere, there is a conflict between what you will call animal left and between a much more powerful, very right-wing discourse of animal rights and a very sort of vague, liberal sort of discourse which can't see what's wrong with the right-wing discourse. Okay, so that is happening right now. And then there's that casteism and Brahminism is tied to vegetarianism in India, that communal politics does weaponize the cow against Muslims, and there's a cynical use of animals because they're not really concerned about the safety of animals as is seen in their attitude towards the dairy industry, and that a morally superior attitude, is unwarranted for those speaking about animal rights, because this is a very difficult subject, because even vegetarian food, even plant-based food involves, as it is produced today, involves the deaths of animals, the killings of animals. So how do you address this? How do you talk about it? And then the last point, which is that diet is closely tied to culture and to identity. And so state-sponsored bans and interventions and court judgments and so on are probably not the best way to go about it, are to be avoided, and that we need to work with and not against vulnerable communities. That's one side of the ledger. The other side of the ledger is that animals are sentient beings, that they do have rich emotional lives, that they do communicate, and that animal rights, the easy label that any concern about animal rights is elitist, which the Upendra Bakshi quote referenced. Well, feminists are called westernized and elitist all the time. Secularism is today being called elitist and Western today by those in power. So that is not an argument that we should accept. That is not something which should be allowed to enter the room in conversation in that way, to shut down conversation. And we have to recognize that, the idea that you're often told that, oh, people are, hunting, and, human beings have always eaten animals, things like that. But there's a difference between the relationship between a hunter and the animal, and between cultivation, and then between what you have today, which is capitalist mass production. So basically, there's a history here. And if family, state, and private property are institutions we can question, we should also question, be willing to change the relationship between humans and non-human animals.
Thank you. I have several questions that I'm going to keep in my head for the moment while we go to Sudhir. Sudhir, the same question, but putting on your hat as a constitutional lawyer. What possibilities, constitutional possibilities, do you see for a more intersectional law that includes non-human animals, but also recognizes the vulnerability of various human communities?
Thanks, Rajesh, and thanks, Kavita, for getting us started. I take it that from Alok's initial Bakshi reading and Kavita's follow-up, that trying to locate where animal rights or an animal politics might rest in a kind of left-right spectrum is part of the intellectual interests for this session. But let me come at this from a slightly different angle. If you look at, and I'm not an animal rights expert, I'm very interested in the topic, so I just come to this with interest. So there, I know that Alok teaches a course on this, and so I'm very ready to be corrected. But my sense is that the legal subjects of the Constitution are of three types. There are citizens, there are persons, and there are things, right? And currently, while we admit of both natural and legal persons, artificial persons, what we mean by artificial legal persons are human creations, the companies and so on. So the barrier between persons and things are, so animals get slotted into the things category. And this three-part categorization has a very long intellectual vintage, and the vintage is Roman civil law, right? We're talking about the Justinian codes. Clearly a European conception of the nature of the natural order of things. And this structure is built into the Constitution. And when we come to the drafting of the Indian Constitution, there was no attempt to get away from this basic order. But there was one very interesting debate about cows, which I think most of you in this audience would know about. But what is interesting is not so much just the fact that cows crept into the Constitution, but the nature of the debate on Article 48. Now, notice that Article 48 is not about recategorizing animals as persons or as citizens. It's not quite that far. It's still on the question of where might animals figure in a constitutional consciousness. While there is no doubt that there's a particular cultural and political constituency pushing for cow protection, the reconciliation that is affected is a more general, some might say scientific, secular reconciliation. Now, here is my thought, and I'll stop here because I know, Rajesh, you want us to make short interventions, and we'll keep coming back, I trust, is that how should we read Article 48 today? And clearly there were contingencies of the period 47 to 50, but today I would try and read that a little more constructively and creatively as being an opportunity, as much of Part 4 of the Constitution is, to eradicate some pre-existing hierarchies, both natural and social. And clearly here in 48, what we need to locate is to tackle the natural hierarchy between humans and non-humans. And though the language is language of animal husbandry, the constitutions, as we crawl and this constitution moves in towards its first century, we must think about creatively engaging the resources we have. And the reason I say this, and I'll just close here, is that is that I don't know that we're going to tease out the three-part barrier in a very quick in a quick period, right? It's more likely that we will need to marshal other ethical and normative resources to make this argument. And 48 is an anchor for this. Not the best anchor, but it's some place to start. So let me stop there and help you move on.
Again, a very rich answer, and I will want to probe you further on those constitutional possibilities. But now I turn to Varda. Varda, you are a great representative of a federation of Indian animal organizations. How do you see the politics of India playing in your work? How do you make a case for animals in a situation where it's such a fraught situation?
Thanks, Rajesh. See, I think taking it from what Kavita and Sudhir were saying earlier, I think one of the fundamental difficulties I have is that we are talking about the cow protection agenda as animal rights, which it's not. The cow protection agenda is speciesist. It only talks about cows. It only talks about Indian cows. It doesn't even include buffaloes. So it's in itself a speciesist agenda. It is not the animal rights ideology at all. So any sort of it's been hijacked. Animal rights has almost been hijacked by the current the current politics, and we find ourselves in a place where the animal rights discourse itself is now, in all conversations, in all narratives, the animal rights discourse is seen as just the cow protection agenda, or it is seen as a sort of some work to do with companion animals, dogs and cats and so on and so forth. Whereas animal rights is simply fundamentally about animals not being economic commodities, animals not being owned, and animals having intrinsic value, and I think those are the basic values that we need to start with when we're talking about animal rights. When we're talking about any work that any sort of whether you were talking about possibilities, and Kavita was saying that well, maybe we shouldn't be engaging the state-led and institutional-led interventions may not be a positive good idea at this point in time because of the current situation. But at the same time, animal rights are, and I think that's why this conversation on intersectionality is really important, because animal rights, which is not speciesist, which is challenging speciesism, is suffering just as much, and which is why it's important to also be challenging that at a state and an institutional level.
Thank you, Varda. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions about this too, about how the challenge to speciesism can be integrated into our solidarity politics. Finally, I want to come to Clifton. Clifton, you have written very eloquently about dehumanization. And one of the things that I was struck by was how during the recent lockdown after the COVID crisis, you included street animals in your interventions, right? And so you've done this kind of intersectional politics in a very fine-grained way. And so can you tell us a little bit about the possibilities of where that might go?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Actually, this is really quite, it's quite difficult, and also I think it's quite welcome. And in fact, I was telling Kavita, we are from the same party. Why is it that both of us are here on it? I know. See, for me, I think I begin with this thing. Like I'm a born non-vegetarian, and I struggle with it sometimes. But I feel that if you look at the entire question of animal rights, like my friend Varda was saying, that the cow protection has become equivalent to animal rights. Actually, I have a little different kind of a view on that. In a way, vegetarianism has become equivalent to to animal rights. And see, that becomes a very big problem then in terms of a cultural kind of an imposition and the various other aspects around that. And so in that sense, I feel that while trying to understand how we approach the question of animal rights, keeping in view, of course, even from a Marxist framework and also say from an animal rights point of view, I think there are certain aspects that cannot be avoided at all, and that is something that we will have to deal with. I'm, for instance, like I'm very, very disturbed by the kind of dietary almost evangelism that one finds in India. So to give you a very small example, malnutrition in India is extremely high. Anemia, for instance, among women is very, very high. The NHFS 5, which has just released its report, shows that this is increased across all segments of society over the pursuant to the last NHFS survey. Now, one of the things that in terms of, say eggs now, whether eggs can be given to children who suffer from malnutrition. I know that, and we actually had to go to court for that, and we got an order several years ago because of which malnutrition children actually get eggs. But Akshay Patra, which is run by ISKCON, which is one of the NGOs that kind of monopolizes the NGO sector in the midday meal scheme, refuses to give eggs to children in Karnataka. In a sense, they determine what the diets of children are, not just in Karnataka, but in several other states. So I think, there's no escaping the kind of hegemony that vegetarianism, or especially linked to Brahmanism, that it has in our nation. And how we negotiate that is something that I feel, it's not about, I don't think it's just about the left finding a way on how to deal with this. I think it's a very crucial question for the animal rights activists. I'll end with this. This entire thing of cow protection, it's not just the Gau Rakshaks. You have animal rights organizations that work in tandem with the Hindutva organizations in trying to ensure that there is no transport of cows. Now, if there's such an alignment of agendas, that doesn't do any service to animal rights at all. So I feel it's a two-way kind of a dialogue that is required, and hopefully, this is just the start of it. Yeah. Thanks. I'll stop here.
Thank you. All right, so we have some fighting words to end this first round. So here's what I'm going to do. So the law has been mentioned by everyone as an anchor through which we want to address this. So I want to take a point that Sudhir made, which is about Article 48, perhaps not being the best framework, but still it exists. So how, given that all of you have engaged with the law, right, it would be great if you could speak to, and I'm going to exclude Sudhir from this first round and then come back to you, Sudhir, in a minute. How do you think that the law can play a role in what you might say extending our compassion to other creatures, while also recognizing that there are human communities whose lives and practices are going to be impacted? And I know all of you have engaged with the courts and the law, so you must have something to say about this. So let me start with, say, Varda.
Thanks, Rajesh. So I think when we're talking about the Indian law is completely welfareist, right? So we are not, it does not recognize the rights and the intrinsic value of animals. So all that the Indian law can do is that all it can help us get at this point in time is better conditions for animals that are currently in systems of exploitation. So we are already in our paradigm is already one where animals are being exploited. And I think what I want to encourage everybody and my co-panelists is that we need to go back to the root. We need to go back to what Kavita was saying, the second part of her ledger, right? That animals are sentient beings, that animals are that they have rich emotional lives, that all of those things which point us to which point to the direction that we need to go beyond the scope of welfare. We need to go beyond the scope of the current existing Indian law. We need to challenge these systems of power which are oppressing animals, which are also oppressing those who have to work in industries where animals are slaughtered, where animal skins are processed. These are not places where which are healthy, which are hygienic. They have a lot of violence. And also in terms of nutrition, I mean, whether if you're giving eggs or other sort of food to children, is that the really best nutrition that can be provided? So I think all of these things have to be addressed. I think all of these systems of exploitation need to be seen together. But we need to start with understanding and appreciating the importance of sentience, the importance of intrinsic value, and then push the existing law beyond welfare, because that's all that we have.
Great, thank you, Varda. Kavita, please.
Unmute, yeah. So see, in fact, as I said in my initial remarks also, I don't think that the law should be the starting point for this conversation. And I'll repeat that, because I really think that first, I think what we need is for a long, protracted process where various movements, including those engaged in animal rights, those engaged in anti-caste and anti-racial struggles, as well as the feminist movements and so on, are actually in conversation with each other, farmers' movements and so on. We have to have that protracted conversation first. What is the way in which a way forward for that conversation interests me far more than what do we do with the law right now? Because I think that's jumping the gun. And I think that that conversation should start, for me, that starts with two things which I think are useful for me. That is the starting point. The first is that I think that we all can see the ways in which racial and ethnic and caste minorities and oppressed groups, along with women, where the rationale for their oppression and exploitation was that they were less than fully human, that they were animal-like, that they were placed on earth by a divine power in the service of man, that is, white male or Brahminical male, whatever it is. And that those things were taken as the given. Those things were taken for centuries as something that could not be challenged. And those are still those notions of everything being, all life being placed on earth by a divine power in the service of human beings, and human beings meaning not the oppressed sections, but basically, people in power and so on, who can take these decisions, big decisions about our climate, about our environment, and about animal lives, is something which is still with us. And so if we can see that analogy and see how that is affecting different sections of human beings as well as non-human lives, and start acknowledging these conversations rather than seeing them as invariably pitted against each other. Because otherwise I can see where this, even today's discussion, I can just practically predict where it's going to go, because it is going to go in this direction that, all right, eggs or no eggs, and so on and so forth. And those don't have easy answers. They really don't, because in today's context, you're not going to be able to say, all right, other nutrition is better and so on and so forth. You're not going to be able to do those right now, is my opinion, because the point is that the easiest way to access this is eggs. And that's going to be fought out by people who say, well, that's part of our diets. And who are you to come and say, you can't eat that and you can eat this, because these are things the government is supposed to provide or get provided through people. And that's why I feel that first, if these conversations were to happen, and then if these affected communities were to be raising these concerns, okay, because and that's where I see the hope, because frankly, I can see all around us, I think we can see that those who are, working class communities are, they are not, there are many instances of them having an organic relationship with non-human life around them, caring for them, protecting them, and so on. And so if that were to be the starting point, it would help. This, another tiny point which I had to add to this was that, for instance, a simple thing that occurs to me as a starting point for conversation, human beings being lynched today, I know I can share this that as a young child, when I had no notion of politics at all, probably my first introduction to any kind of public conscience or public courage was what I received from my mother when we would intervene to prevent the lynching of a street dog. Okay. And that courage, and I'm saying this because this is a safe space. I know that YouTube probably is not, but I'm saying this because I think that that gives me the courage today. And I've done this on streets and in railway trains and so on, to step in and prevent the lynching of a child who is accused of pickpocketing or stealing, or or someone on the street who is accused of such things. And now you're also having Muslim bodies and Dalit bodies lynched in these manners. What is the, or tiger lynched by people who are afraid of, by villagers who are setting it afire and so on. What is the way in which we understand this tendency? How can we share experiences of these things and wonder where this impulse to lynch comes from, and how that can be prevented? Maybe that could be another starting point. Third starting point for a conversation is simply the dairy industry. Okay, because those who are saying Gau Mata and those who are saying, and it's not just the Hindutva people, I totally agree with Clifton there. Loads of people in the liberal animal rights space who do not describe, who are unwilling to, who are willing to say, well, at least if this much is happening, so what? At least let there be a ban on beef. So what if there is? In fact, there are very few who don't say that. And so to them, we should say, hello, instead of tackling beef first, let's start talking about dairy. Let's talk to dairy farmers about the conditions under which farm animals are treated. Let the conversation begin there with a slightly less marginalized community than others. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kavita and Clifton.
Actually, I'll just make 3 points. I'll come back to your legal question because I think I'll just end with that so that I've at least answered your question that way. But just taking off from where Kavita said, in fact, even our own intervention during the lockdown, it's something that was in a way, it was because of our workers. I know many people know this, but the sanitation workers, the people who sweep the streets, the women, which is predominantly, it's like 90% women, 100% Dalit. It's 100% reservation for those workers. Most of them have a friend in a dog in the streets that they sweep. So if you, people don't notice this much, but if you actually see the woman who's sweeping your road, pushing a cart, you will find that there's inevitably a dog that is always with her. And they care for that dog more than anyone else. It's like incredible the kind of love that they have. So when we have our union meetings, it will not only be the union meeting of all the workers, all the dogs will be there with us. So a big part of these meetings. So when the lockdown happened, in fact, it was a conversation with one of the workers that kind of triggered this thought, that what is happening to the street dogs during this lockdown? Who's feeding them? And which is why we went to court. Like I said, I'll come to that later. But I just want you to keep this in mind. A very, very organic relationship that people have with which in a way I think is just incredible. And just one more thing that I always remember is I spent a considerable time of my life with the Narmada Bachao Andolan and with working with Adivasi communities over there. And I in fact remember there was a song that we used to sing, Kidi Mukudi Amri Se, which basically is Kidi Mukudi is Kidi Mukudi. It's like whatever this kuti kuti
Insects.
Yeah. So basically the entire imagination is that this dam is coming up. It's driving us out of our homes. It's driving my children out of my homes. It's driving our families out. It's submerging the forests and it is destroying the kiddies and the mukidis. So the understanding itself is that's for me such a comprehensive understanding, which unfortunately I've not heard that kind of an approach from a lot of these liberal, animal rights circles that, I've kind of seen. But coming now to in fact, I know, Deer, you must have seen this, the A. Nagaraja judgment that Radhakrishna has. It's an incredible judgment. And I don't know, actually, Rajesh, let me tell you, in my opinion, talking about animal rights is the easiest thing in the courts. And I think, anyone can put 2 and 2 together as to why that is happening. If you look at the entire trajectory of the ban on cow slaughter, the judgments, say from the Qureshi judgment of the 50s all the way to now, very, very understandably how they came to be such kind of a constitutional sanctity granted to those which I would imagine are patently, illegal laws. But Radhakrishna's judgment actually is quite interesting. Do I have 2 minutes? I'll just like to read out 2 paragraphs. No problem?
Go for it.
Yeah. So this is a judgment of Justice Radhakrishnan. This is in 2014. Everyone knows it, of course, as the Jallikattu case. But in terms of the rights of animals, this is what we used when we argued during the during COVID. So we filed an application on behalf of the People's Union of Civil Liberties saying that lockdown is hitting not just people, it's also hitting animals. And it's not just street animals. We also argued that you have like, hundreds of pet shops that are there in every single city across the state. And these pet shops are closed and animals will perhaps be dying of hunger. It was a speculation, but this is the argument that we made. And luckily for us, the bench that heard us was actually convinced by our arguments, and there were series of orders passed where state authorities were directed to file reports. They had to go and check every single pet store. They had to ensure that animal rights activists have the right to go and feed, street animals, so on and so forth. But in that, we had used this judgment. So what the Supreme Court says is this: all living creatures have inherent dignity and a right to live peacefully and right to protect their well-being, which encompasses protection from beating, kicking, overdriving, overloading, tortures, pain and suffering, etc. Human life, we often say, is not like animal existence, a view having anthropocentric bias, forgetting the fact that animals have also got intrinsic value, intrinsic worth and value, as Varda was saying, that Kavita was saying. Interestingly, this judgment says that there are 5 rights. It recognizes 5 freedoms of animals. And these 5 freedoms are freedom from hunger, thirst, and malnutrition, freedom from fear and distress, freedom from physical and thermal discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, and freedom to express normal patterns of behavior. In fact, the first point, the freedom from hunger, thirst, and malnutrition, that was the point that we used to drive home, that animals, street animals not being given food during lockdown amounts to a violation of their rights. And finally, what the court holds is this. It says, every species has a right to life and security, subject to the law of the land, which includes depriving its life out of human necessity. Article 21 of the Constitution, by safeguarding the rights of humans, protects life, and the word life has been given an expanded definition, and any disturbance from the basic environment, which includes all forms of life, including animal life, which are necessary for human life, fall within the meaning of Article 21 of the Constitution. As far as animals are concerned, in our view, life for human beings, but to lead a life with some intrinsic worth, honor, and dignity. I think, anyone who loves animals, and I love animals, and Kavita knows the kind of problems my dear friend Mr. Gabru, my cat, and me are having. It's like literal relationship problems that both of us are going to. But I still feel, that we have to come from a space where we acknowledge that it's really, if you think that things are hunky-dory and we'll walk hand in hand in this, it's not. There are competing interests over here. There are underlying structural problems over here. There are definitional problems over here. We'd have to accept that and then try and find, that some moral ground in which we can move forward. It cannot be that vegetarianism is okay, is the only thing possible. And that way we can... Yeah, Rajesh.
Rajesh, Varda had a hand up earlier.
Okay.
Can I come in just now?
Yes, please.
So I just wanted to comment on something that Kavita was saying, and it also links somewhat to what Clifton, you're saying about that vegetarianism is not the, that we have to find a way that is, that it's not just that vegetarian is the only thing. I completely agree that that we do. I think Kavita, what you were raising about the dairy issue, I think that's very valid. I think absolutely, that's I think everybody needs to be thinking about If we are talking about animal rights, we certainly need to be talking about the dairy issue. And in fact, despite all the cow protection agenda, the dairies in India have continue to be continue to have really bad conditions. The problem with this, the problem with intersectionality of all of these different movements that we're discussing is that there is still, we are talking about the welfare of animals. We are not talking about their fundamental values, fundamental intrinsic values that they have. And that is, as soon as we start talking about all of these other things in terms of whether eggs should be eaten or eggs should not be eaten, I totally agree. That's a conversation that has to be had much later. But first, we need to all acknowledge that just as different categories of people were recognized as property at some points in time, and that was challenged, we need to be challenging that animals are not property. And until we can all agree upon basic values, all of these questions of whether eggs are better or what, I totally agree that these are all systemic problems, that these are all interlinked, that we do not have, it is not a binary world. We cannot have simple, easy solutions. And I'm not even suggesting that we need to find those solutions right now or in the near future. But we need to have that common understanding of what is it that we are challenging, what is our commonality, what are those common values around which we are talking about, and not, I think even agreement around those is it's hugely lacking at this point in time.
Thank you, Varda. And I'm going to use that as a segue to Sudhir to end this portion of today's panel discussion. Varda, you mentioned about the intrinsic capacities that animals have, and the much greater scientific understanding we have now of the capacities of other species. Sudhir, how do you, given what you mentioned about the chain of being that is encoded into the Indian Constitution and coming back from, going back to Roman times, what levers do we have to introduce a different scientific understanding of the capacities of other species into this, discussion of Article 48 or whatever mechanisms the Constitution offers?
Okay. It's been a fascinating conversation and very educative for me. So I'm going to come at the questions from a slightly different angle. So let me start with the decision that Clifton read out and Alok has posted on the chat, and return to Varda's point. So the court in the judgment that we're discussing, which is a cruelty case, not a diet case. So in that case, the court erases the distinction between animals and humans in its discussion of Article 21. So what's very interesting is that in para 62, for those of you who are interested in all this arcana, the critical quotation that the court uses is one from a very old 1800s US case, where the US court said that the right to life is not mere animal existence. That's exactly what it says. And in this judgment on para 62, they get rid of the word animal and they delete that and they say it's not mere existence, right? And then go on to say that that there should be a certain equivalence. But I guess the non arcane point that Varda was making is that if we reach the conclusion that there is a moral equivalence between human and non-human lives, why should we do that, or how do we do that? Before getting to what's the upshot of doing that, let's just think for a moment about why we should do that. One early position in equality law, and a couple of you have used the language of intersectionality, it rests on the idea that all humans are basically equal. And I'm only paraphrasing a very important article by Jeremy Waldron called Basic Equality. And Waldron argues that essentially all humans, I mean, it's not like we are a species of such variation that we have dwarfs and we have giants, or that range of variation that makes us fundamentally unequal, either individually or in collectives. So the moment, even if there is individual variation between members of the human species, in collectives we erase those differences. So the proposition that we are of all equal moral worth emerges for Waldron from this idea of basic equality, which he takes to be both natural and social fact. But maybe we can start somewhere else. We can start somewhere else and go back in time a little bit. And here I'm thinking of Jeremy Bentham. And I know that Bentham gets a lot of bad press, utilitarianism and all that. But Bentham, in a very interesting passage on thinking through why we take humans in the first instance to be equal, he works through a range of political criteria. Is it that humans can think, sentience? Is it that humans can speak? Is it that humans can feel? And then he comes to the very, for his time and space, surprising conclusion that really what we can say is that humans can feel. And what do we mean by that? That humans can suffer. And he says, but so can animals. Animals can suffer too. If suffering is the premise on which we take we take moral worth to emerge from the potentiality of suffering, then the basis for the distinction between humans and other species disappears. And this is Bentham, arguably the most important political and moral philosopher of his time and maybe of all time, writing about this very serious problem. This is not an idea that Bentham developed at length and worked through in detail. It was not his, but notice that, I mean, I saw that there were a couple of conversations about utilitarianism, and there was a sort of premise that, I mean, I took it, that there was an intuition that if we were utilitarian, we would all treat animals as things, not necessarily. And so the question is, what is of moral worth? And if we take that road, then some very uncomfortable consequences follow, including some of the consequences that Kavita and Clifton are alerting us to. Let me conclude with one last sentence. Is there some space between these positions? That, and this returns to Rajesh's question. There are things and there are persons, but is there something that we can do that is not quite things and maybe not quite persons? Now, this might be unsatisfactory for many of you in this forum who are passionate about the moral equivalence between animals and humans, but it might be worth thinking and working this out as we grapple with the rather difficult problems that we've already confronted on the panel. Back to you.
Thank you, Sudhir. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a break. We're going to show a clip from a wonderful new movie that's again been done by a couple of Animaleft people, Gautam Sonti and Nirupama Sharma. I'm going to paste the link to that video right here in the chat window, because if for some reason, there's a, just give me one sec. So if the video stutters when I play it, you at least have access to the video. So I've just pasted that, and I'm going to play that in a second. So let me share my screen.
We're here to show solidarity because we're like pet lovers.
So pet lovers, but not necessarily animal lovers?
Oh, animal lovers, all animals, yeah. haven't turned vegan or anything like that, honestly speaking. Yeah. I mean, I compartmentalize that, and my love for animals is like completely different from what I consume, honestly. Yeah.
आपको कभी भी किसी भी क्रांति की हमारी जरूरत पड़ेगी तो तलवार लेके हम सबसे पहले मैदान में होंगे। भारत माता की जय।
एनालाइज करने की कोशिश करते हैं और सिर्फ गौ रक्षा तक रोकने की कोशिश करते हैं। देखिए, एनिमल्स के खिलाफ, जानवरों के खिलाफ क्रूएल्टी हर समाज में, हर रिलीजन में हो रही है।
In the name of the cow, we must now create a culture of diversity, of non-violence, of love and compassion. Because if animals and humans are part of one family, then you cannot do violence to humans, just as you cannot do violence to animals.
A lot of Dalits eat beef, so those communities are now, getting attacked through this whole discourse. Yes, I am a compassionate being, and I do go to any extent to help those in distress. And maybe you are right that it should extend very fairly towards animals also. But at this point of time, I must say, it's partial. An occasional meat eater, not completely eating it for all meals at all. I mean, that doesn't exist.
The calf would usually starve to death. But this is the most gruesome practice, though.
Watching especially this documentary, your whole perspective on life will change.
So we don't see these kind of things there. It must be happening somewhere.
It happens, yeah, it happens all over the world.
It's happening. It's not that. It's not happening. But how do they do this? This is so inhuman. Huh?
This is what you want to have on your plate.
So this is a...
Oh my God.
These creatures, the one I usually eat, were birthed solely for the purpose of to become my food.
So don't you think there's something wrong in that fact that we are actually birthing creatures solely for the purpose of having food?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Where do you draw the line of sentience?
Yeah, sentience is, it's pretty obvious what sentience actually happens.
Where do you draw the line?
There is no line. It's the fact that
if you value life, you should value every and each life.
Tell me, what do you think about the environmental changes that are happening right now?
I haven't done enough reading to give you a solid answer on that. Slaughterhouses are the sole reason for this depleting water levels. Then that makes a valid case. Rather than ascribing moral values, ascribing moral values to the slaughter values, you should be pursuing these things. Take away water, which is much required for other reasons, should be fought in that way.
That's what I'm saying. That there are many ways to this perspective.
Yeah, but assigning morality is a cheap trick.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying. Especially here, standing right would not make any further might further your cause.
No, I just changed 3 people's minds about it, so it does.
It may. But let me be clear. Look at my face. I have no moral dilemma on eating any of the animals provided. I enjoy it and I am thankful for them becoming my food. And just like when I am dead, the other creatures will feed on me. I'm also happy with that as well.
The sheds from where the animals are kept for overnight stay, from there the animals will be brought, in 2 lanes. There'll be 2 machines where we call them as restrainers. Animal restrainer conveyors or restrainer trap, we call it, where the animal walks on its own, and when it reaches a particular point, suddenly the ground gives way. So the animal, it's walking till such time, there's a ground below its feet, and then it is restrained on 2 sides, and then suddenly the conveyor takes over, and suddenly the ground caves in, and the animal is caught. It cannot understand what's happening, and that is when we give the electric stunning. So after the stunning is done, the animal is put on one of its legs, it's hoisted on a conveyor and taken overhead, okay, after the bleeding, yeah. When you look at an animal, you know, that day, all your engineers are standing next to you. We are trying to see that whether the machinery is working, whether the animal has achieved stunning and all that. But then when you look at the animal, you know, it is very pathetic. I was having my camera and I was taking the photographs. And I could see that animal looking at me. I was talking to the animal. I was just talking to the animal. Because I talked to my dogs, I was talking to the animal. I was just saying they're going to kill you now, you know. I was just talking in Tamil. I just said, they're going to kill you now. Do you know that? So it was just looking at me. I was so shocked to see that there were tears in its eyes. It is very pathetic to see a large animal, you know, being fallen by a human being. There's no justice in killing. I definitely see no justice in killing. Whatever may be the reason, you are nobody to take some life. You are nobody. That is there. But what to do? This is the reality. Live with it. Very difficult, very difficult. And if you're an animal lover, it's very, very difficult. You hate yourself, you know, at that point you hate yourself. And then you look at all the things you do for years together to bring a project about, and then say, for this you did it. So that is very difficult to accept.
Even if you don't give a damn about animals, like you don't care about them at all, the fact is that the industry that abuses animals never stops there. It abuses its employees, it abuses people who live around it. So if you care about labor welfare, if you care about, let's say, bonded labor, or even if you care about the fact that people who live in and around factory farms shouldn't have to deal with huge housefly infestation, you got to support it, because this is where it all begins. If someone says it's okay to hurt an animal, they will obviously say it's okay to hurt a labor. Anybody who can't speak up will get abused, because that's the cycle of violence that animal abusers are part of.
Thank you. So lovely clip. I want to maybe give our panelists and perhaps even a participant a chance to respond to this clip for a minute, if you have any immediate responses.
I do.
Oh, go for it.
Just really, just a very one-line response, basically, that I think that the response of the person who runs that slaughterhouse, that I didn't catch his name, but I think that honesty might just be a starting point. That's exactly what I mean when I say that you at least acknowledge that there is something deeply unjust about the system which causes this kind of hurt. And the other thing I just wanted to briefly, because he's also talking about that suffering and that sense of, that sentience. And it reminded me of this letter that Rosa Luxemburg writes to her friend from prison, where she talks about the water buffaloes that have been, wild water buffaloes that have been trapped and brought and are treated as pack animals inside the prison. It's extremely painful. She talks about looking into the eye of the animal, which is asking, why am I being treated this way? So that was just a response.
Thank you, Kavita. Any one more quick response, if we have one? Go for it, Sudhir.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there is a discussion in the chat about legal personhood and the complications that come with that. But just moving from the film, okay. Let me start with the legal personhood point and then work to the film. On the legal personhood point, I think we know that in recent times, legal personality of forests, of rivers, are common, at least in some jurisdictions, and we are trying to work through that. There is also the question of artificially intelligent robots and so on and so forth, and we treat that as a boundary problem for legal personhood. And animal rights or animal subjects also raise problems of personhood. And the point that I was trying to make earlier is that what criterion might we use? And it seems to me that the criterion of suffering is very important. I don't want to hammer that point, but I think that it helps us negotiate between these boundary problems on legal personhood. But I think a second issue is then who can claim on behalf of forests and rivers, and who can claim on behalf of animals. And then the question of the state is very important, and we don't want to at least in our political context, for all the reasons discussed in this panel and elsewhere, quickly lapse from recognizing personhood to conferring those rights on the state, and we'd be in a difficult spot at that point. For the film, I mean, can almost recognize some of the areas that Gautam's been shooting in. So I suppose that these conversations are commonplace, and as Kavita suggested, need to happen more. I think we need to have more engaged and candid conversations if this is the kind of understanding that we need to develop, that cross-species radical empathy is possible.
Okay, so that's a point. Go ahead, Clifton.
Yeah, see, again, I mean, this is something that always troubles me, and just being very honest over here. We yet again get into this trope of suffering. Yet again it is in relation to vegetarianism. Yet again it is in regard to dietary preferences. Like, I would really like to see, as aggressive propaganda, say in regard to developmental projects that submerge forests. So one doesn't find that. So if you were to understand the entire spectrum of animal rights, right, and the entire violations that take place, what I really find, something troubling, and which is something, I'm open to being corrected on this, is that it inevitably only focuses on dietary cultures. And for me, that I think really is not the way to go forward. I think acknowledging the kind of situation we are in, acknowledging the kind of political climate that pervades in this nation, I would say, which is why I began with this, that I think even the animal rights movement activists themselves need to think about what are the issues that they are prioritizing. If you are going to prioritize, prevention of cattle transport, if you are going to prioritize only poultry farms, then really the space for dialogue, as far as I understand, becomes extremely limited. But if we were to understand it in a much more broader sense, let's say, I would say, let us say not suffering, let us say that if compassion then becomes the lens through which we are approaching this, then this entire capitalist model of development, which is destroying the forest, that becomes something that you'd have to raise your voice against. But somehow I feel, this going back to non-vegetarians are amoral. That's really not going to start any dialogue, in my extremely, extremely honest opinion.
Okay. You've raised a lot of issues. I want to end the discussion of this clip by saying that it's part of a longer documentary film, and both filmmakers are actually in this call, and their contact details have been posted in the chat window. So if you want to contact them, you have their email addresses. And
Rajesh,
thank
is
you
it
so much.
possible to comment on what Clifton said just for a second?
Go for
I
it.
won't take more than a minute, I promise. Clifton, the animal rights movement is not just limited to vegetarianism. Unfortunately, it is seen as being just limited to vegetarianism, probably because the most interventions are often made on farmed animals. And farmed animals and the reason for that is not because it is cattle or it is poultry or something, because farmed animals is the largest number of animals that are impacted in exploitative systems. So it is not dogs. You only have about, estimates are varied, but about 30 million dogs in India. You have billions of hens that are living in factory farm conditions in India just now. So which is why It's a very strategic choice that the animal rights movement has made to work on farmed animal issues. And that doesn't include just poultry, that doesn't include just vegetarianism, it includes improving living conditions of these animals, it includes engaging with consumers, engaging with the industry. It's a well thought of strategy on how we can reduce the suffering of these animals. Also, I mean, I wouldn't think of it as, this is all about making people vegetarian. I mean, I think even this dialogue today is not about talking about vegetarianism. Unfortunately, I think vegetarianism comes up whenever we're talking with in the context of different movements, because the issue of personal choice comes up every time whenever I mean, I think it seems impossible to escape that. It's really, I keep sort of, I'm at the sake of repeating myself, but it's really about going back to the value of animals. It's about what earlier Sudhir was saying about some of the chat comments. It's about how do we really recognize that animals cannot also be, eaten, stripped of their skins, killed, exploited, tied up, beaten, dragged, I mean, unbelievable things we do to animals. So that's really, I think, what the fundamental conversation is. And it's not an arbitrary choice about vegetarianism. That is certainly not what the animal rights philosophy talks about. Cow protection I'm not a cow protectionist. I wouldn't know, what their agenda would be.
If it's possible, I'd just like a brief intervention also at some point. Yeah.
I think that this is a good, let's continue this, please.
See, I really, what Varda said, absolutely. I mean, I totally credit what she's saying, and I think that those are important interventions. I think what, I think at least, I won't speak on behalf of Clifton, but I think what he pointed to is that in the public perception, let's say, okay, discourse, perception. And I know that Varda, as a feminist activist, I mean, as a feminist activist, I can't be responsible for all the rubbish perceptions of feminism that abound, okay? So you are not responsible for that nonsense that goes on. So no, you don't have to answer for that rubbish. But I'm just saying that that does exist. And so how do we as people who, and I say we here, how do we as people who are wanting to raise animal rights issues, strategically, how do we address the issue louder to say that, hello, profiling meat eaters as cruel, profiling entire communities as cruel, or profiling individuals as cruel for their dietary choices, that is racist, that is not on, and this is not just in India. There are similar experiences that people have had all over, where, people from, Chinese immigrants being profiled as cruel in the US, Black Americans being profiled as cruel for dog fighting, all of that. There's a whole lot of that. My point is that we have to find a way to have a conversation between these movements where we acknowledge that those concerns are just as valid as these, and these concerns about the way we treat animals, the appalling cruelty to which we subject animals, is valid too. And this is an entire system we are a part of. None of us have clean hands here. We are as part of a system that inflicts systemic cruelty onto all kinds of living beings, animals as well as human beings. And frankly, we are even those of us who are feminist activists, child rights activists, we are far from beginning to actually have a solution that says, okay, this is how we see the world going, where it will be rid of all these things. We don't have solutions for most of those things, even child labor, for instance. Therefore, instead of thinking, okay, why aren't you vegetarian? Why aren't you vegan? And that is not something someone like Varda is doing. But a whole lot of people are doing that, which is what shuts down conversation, which is what where you cannot really. And so I think that rather than suffering, I think if we were to say, okay, what are the systemic forms of cruelty that are going on here? Not an individual eating something, but systemic in terms of entire industries. How are those industries treating? That is why I'm saying, instead of picking on the individuals who are generally from very vulnerable communities, if we were to look for a slightly, which I know that we are doing, I know that activists like Varda and our organization are doing, which is to look, bring those into focus. So I wish, for instance, I feel organizations like PETA do a whole lot of harm because they're not bringing that into focus enough at all, and they are the most visible people around. I've heard about Varada's organization for the second time in my life today. The first time from the makers of this film. Okay, I haven't heard of this before. Most people haven't. And so I'm saying, how do we help to bring these into focus more and say these big industries, how are they treating human beings? How are they treating animals? And how do we change this? So if we were to tackle those in that manner and take a firm stand to say, no, in the conversation around animal rights, profiling communities as cruel is just not on. We're going to raise our voices against it as animal rights activists. We are not going to judge people on what they eat. No, that's not the way we begin. Yeah.
Okay. So
I just want to respond to that. Sorry, Rajesh. I totally agree, Kavita, on what you're saying. I think it's very important not to create those enemy images and to break down those barriers. I don't think it helps, and I think not creating enemy images comes from the very basic value of non-violence that animal rights comes from. So if we do not condone violence to animals, we cannot condone violence to people, including within multiple movements. I think, I can't comment on what PETA does or not does, but I think, rooting some of these conversations in maybe the current issues that we are facing in that are in conflict. And I totally agree with you. I am not at all saying that, that any of us needs to be, we need to be aware, we need to be, we need to have the context, in this conversation. I totally agree with that. And I think with that, I think a starting point maybe could be some of the specific issues that are in conflict just now, because I think the problem with some of these discussions, often they end up being about whether someone eats meat or not, versus maybe some of the conversations around what are the areas of conflict at this point in time, which of course one of the biggest ones is all the cow protection agenda. And maybe those are some of the things, and that's certainly a issue that is discussed within the animal rights community. It is also, most people that in the animal rights, I know there's a large majority that would say that, okay, well, the beef ban is still a good thing and so on, but there is also a group of people, a growing majority of people who do also not agree with that, who do, do not condone the violence in the name of cow protection naturally. So I think that I totally agree. I think that's a good starting point, rooted in reality and the present context.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, I've been looking at the chat window and this very rich topic of discussions that are emerging. And we have 10 minutes or so left for this panel. I want to bring the panel back to perhaps a discussion topic that will be at the heart of what everybody says, right? So there is a capitalist system which produces animal matter for consumption in many ways, and that is primarily an industrial capitalist system, and it harms everybody. It harms the animals in it, obviously, but it also harms farmers. It harms the environment. It's a huge contributor to carbon emissions. So, can we speak to that system itself and how you might potentially act intersectionally to address that particular challenge, right? Which is that we want to change the way we produce food. I mean, I think that that's something that we can all agree on. And so if you could speak a little bit about the transformation of that system itself and how you might want to see it, that would be great. So I'll start with, since Varda and Kavita were the last two, I'm going to start with Clifton, and then maybe Sudhir, and then Varda, and then Kavita, and then we'll quit.
No, I mean, this is a tough conversation, but we're having it, and I'm really quite glad, I mean, Varda, thank you. I mean, clarifying that. It was no way was I pointing to you when I made that comment, just to clarify. So I would say that let us think of this as a start. I don't think that it's the way Rajesh you're saying. It's not necessarily true that animal rights, at least in terms of conversations that I tried to have with some of the activists, that they even look at the capitalist kind of lobby or the capitalist mode of production as being something that they should be raising their voices against. I mean, so I'm quite just I'm curious to know where you have that, where you're introducing this as being something that could be a starting point. Because in my honest opinion, I don't think that they see that. But if we are actually able to persuade that kind of an agenda, I would imagine then that could be some kind of a starting point where there is some possibility of an intersectionality over there. And I agree. I mean, I would hope for the and I keep telling Kavita several times. One always struggles with this, with being a non-vegetarian and being an animal lover. One always struggles with it. It's really not easy. But to have that space for a conversation where the structures of hierarchy, the structures of dominance, of power, and the way they operate, if one can actually move away from that, one can address that and be honest enough and then move forward, perhaps. So yeah, I mean, if this is a start towards, say, some grand kind of a intersectionality movement against capitalism, I think this that'd be fantastic. Thanks.
Thank you, Clifton. Sudhir.
So I'm going to turn to an unlikely source, right, which is to point in a direction where someone is thinking structurally and an individual ethic about animals, but someone I think most people on this panel are going to find uncomfortable, and that's Gandhi. And Gandhi's position, as we all know, was shaped not by Hindu scriptural texts or Jaina scriptural sources alone, but also by the animal rights movements in England as he found them. And so they seem to have, and as we've come to understand, he learned all his public speaking at animal rights groups. That was his first kind of getting out in England. And what he seems to have come down to at that point is the idea that there's something structurally wrong with the way animals are treated. And this is a pathology, not just about the human-animal interface, but about the nature of social structures. So for Gandhi, yes, there was a position around vegetarianism, but not a shunning of all animal products, but one that talked about cooperative farming and had a different way in which human-animal ecological relations were configured. And I mentioned Gandhi because I take it that some of the discussion in the chat is, are we going to sketch utopian futures, or should we just subscribe to a progressivist position which at least can forge agreement about the next necessary step? We don't know what the futures are like, what this final endpoint of this kind of argument might be, but at least let's agree about necessary next steps. I'm not clear. I mean, I think the chat makes it clear that that people disagree about whether you need to sketch a utopian or just a progressivist next step. But let me suggest that Gandhi is interesting as a cultural translator, as someone trying to build some common ground between very different philosophical and ethical traditions, thinking about the relationship between animals and human beings. Not the last word, but an interesting early take on that question.
Thank you, Sudhir. And in fact, there's an interesting debate that Gandhi organizes, I think, in Young India, in fact, about shooting stray dogs who are rabid. And I think that he was, yeah, I think he was in the late 20s or 30s. So it might be something worth reading. Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to go to Varda. And
so Rajesh, I understood your question as sort of transformative systems, right? Moving forward,
yes.
Including transformative food systems.
And specifically from, your individual and organizational perspective, how you might.
Of course. Yeah. So I think it's, I think it has to be twofold. I think, of course, at a systemic, at a, at an institutional level, I think and transformative food systems specifically, I think looking at the more industrial farming of animals just now, is perhaps certainly the next step in terms of also, when as an intersectional issue, because it's not just about animals, it's about so many other groups, groups of people that are involved, the bad conditions and so on. I mean, all of that's been covered earlier. So I think in the, in the short term, when I say short term, I mean sort of like the more tangible, easier, practical manifestation of this is the, sort of is some sort of working together under common understanding around industrial systems. And I think also at a more substantial level to really, sort of start creating that understanding, that dialogue, which comes back to recognizing how animals like other groups like women, I mean, that they're not property, and then challenging that fundamental construct on which everything else is stacked up. We treat animals as things, as property, as objects, we commodify them, and then creating that deeper understanding, making sure that at an individual level, at an organizational level, all our own journeys also are inclusive of other movements, and I mean, that of course cuts across the panel. So those are two ways I would see that.
And over to you, Kavita.
Sure, I'm unmuted, yeah. So two things which I think that I would try to do through our organizations. One would be to, as a Marxist, communist movement, a Marxist movement, my effort would be, I think, to try and expand the conversation about what a Marxist approach to animal rights and animal liberation would look like. And acknowledging, for instance, the way we see that human beings have a, essentially the movement is to get human beings to live full lives as human beings rather than lives that are constrained and, flattened out and restricted by capitalist exploitation and oppression. So likewise, the fact that animals as living beings have a right to live lives that are full as animals, where they're able to use their instincts as animals, their natural behavior as animals to survive, to live, and to, experience life as animals, to the, so that their animality, in a sense, has a right to be there. They're not just things which you can keep in tiny structures in mass farms and so on. So one thing would be to have, begin to have this conversation on the organized left, at least where my own organizations to which I belong are there. That's one thing. The other thing I would say is that there are specific areas of conflict where I would, where it's very, very hard to intervene, but I would think that those interventions are called for. Let me reference one of those. For instance, in Pilibhit, where my party has some work among the rural poor, extremely poor and marginalized forest-dwelling communities. These are communities that are regularly in danger of having children or human members of their families killed by tigers. So there's man-eating tigers or tigers that are killing people and so on. And so the regular conflict there is the demand, the popular demand there is that the government should get in somebody to kill the tiger. And if you don't do that, we're going to do it ourselves, and we're going to burn, kill, whatever. Now, the intervention required there is a very popular demand. It's a universal demand there. Even the notion that there could be something else is not welcome, period. I think that the need would be, like the demand for prohibition is so popular on the feminist movement among women, okay? Everyone wants prohibition, and yet we know what costs prohibition brings to actual human beings. It's not a solution. And so I think that they're, having this conversation to say, well, your concern is that this whole tiger thing is being used to evict you from your villages and turn this into a tiger reserve and so on and so forth. That is an absolutely valid concern. You have a right to live your lives without fearing that you will be killed by a tiger tomorrow. That is also absolutely a right. But the solution can't be that to say, okay, we'll lynch tigers, or we want the government to, bring in people and kill tigers and indiscriminately. So what is going to be the way forward? I don't have an easy answer here. I don't have a solution here, but I would think that at least beginning to have a conversation that says we do have to look for other resources, people who have experienced these conflicts in other continents, other places all over the globe, and have found other solutions. Let's demand those solutions here, which are more, both more useful, effective, and also which are morally, ethically more in keeping with what we stand for or what we think we stand for.
Oh, thank you, Kavita. That's as good a place as any for us to end this wonderful discussion. I want to say a few things in closing. First, I want to appreciate loudly how open and generous the panelists in this discussion have been, how they've given them freely of the long experience they've had in their respective domains. So first of all, thank you, and a round of applause for all the panelists. I'll let everybody clap virtually, however they do it. I'll do it this way, all right? The second I want to do is to thank Alok, who's the co-organizer with me and several others in Animaleft of this meeting. It's taken several months of preparation for us to get here, and Alok has been the key instigator in making this happen. So I want to publicly thank him for making this happen. Thank you, Alok. And finally, I want to thank Nilankar and Reggie at DUS, who have been behind the scenes, but making sure that this seminar actually happens and the audience is welcomed and brought into the space. So that I also want to thank Reggie and Nilankar. And finally, I want to thank all the participants for the ideas that you've been sharing in the chat window, for making this actually a very well attended and lively session, and for hopefully coming to the next such session when we organize it.
And thank you, Rajesh, for being a great moderator.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. Thank you. So we hope to, so the recordings will be made available. It's actually being live streamed on YouTube. So if you just want the unvarnished version, as soon as this is over, it'll be available on YouTube. But an edited version will also be made available, and we'll send it to anyone who was on the registration form. If you're not on the registration form, then maybe, so yeah, exactly. So the links to DUS Critique will give you the YouTube link. Thank you, everybody. And
thanks so much.
We look forward to having more of this.
Thank you. I'll just quickly say that, guys, we've put a short link of a Milab fundraiser for DUS. I'm also part of Animaleft, but I'm also part of DUS, and we run this entirely on a voluntary basis, and we're doing a small crowdfunding to meet our operational costs. Zoom is an expensive platform. If you feel like, if you can, please go online on the Milab fundraiser for DUS and make a small contribution so we can keep bringing these really interesting discussions online for you. I've also posted the YouTube link where the recording is already up on live and you can share with people. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. This is the commitment of Thus. This is the commitment of Animaleft. We really put it together today. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kavita. Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you, Sudhir. Thank you, Varda. Thank you, Clifton. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. And have a good evening, those who are in India, and have a good day, the rest of us.